I hope your favorite team does not need a wide receiver this year because the 2023 receiver class is the weakest we've seen in some time. But welcome to the channel. If you're new here, consider subscribing and dropping a like on the video if you do enjoy it. We're on the road to 5,000 subscribers, so if you're new to the channel, be sure to hit that button. I would also like to apologize if I sound a little bit congested in this video. I've been battling some severe cold/flu sickness, but regardless of all of that, I am not a huge fan of this upcoming receiver class. I've studied a lot of the top guys and seen what many quote-unquote draft experts have to say about the group, and I've been really unimpressed when comparing it to the supreme talent from 2019 to 2022, when it felt like every year people were arguing, hey, this might be the best class we've ever seen. And I think over the course of the past few years, fans of the NFL have gotten really accustomed to wide receivers getting drafted high in the first round, and there being a lot of high impact players being really good from day one, and I think that's made this year's class just a tiny bit overrated. Now, ranking players is hard to begin with, but especially with this year's wide receiver class, they're all pretty close together. However, I do think most people agree with the consensus top 6 wide receivers, which in no particular order include Quentin Johnston, Jordan Addison, Zay Flowers, Jackson Smith-Njigba, Jalen Hyatt, and Josh Downs. So I want to talk a little bit about these receivers and then compare it as a whole to the past couple of drafts and why I think it's such a weak class. Up first is Josh Downs out of North Carolina. He put together back-to-back really nice seasons for the Tar Heels with 1,300 yards and 8 touchdowns in 2021, and then breaking 1,000 yards again with 11 touchdowns just this past year. Now, Downs is a pretty interesting player. I do think he is good and an NFL caliber player. He's got good agility and explosiveness, so I do think he'll be good after the catch in the NFL. And a lot of people also think he has some of the best hands out of anybody in the draft, so there are some things to like. But the reason he may not be drafted in the first round is largely due to his size. He's only 5'9", 171 pounds, so there are concerns with him being able to beat press coverage or being able to fight off physical corners from throwing off his route. And to combine with that, he doesn't really have elite speed like we've seen from other really productive small wide receivers in the NFL like Tyreek Hill or Jalen Waddle. He only ran a 4.4840 at the combine, which is still a decent time, but for his size, you would like that to be a little bit faster. So I think in the end, he's going to be a slot wide receiver in the NFL, maybe with a potential to be a wide receiver 2 in the long term. I've seen him compared to players like Rondale Moore, Elijah Moore, or maybe his max potential could be a Tyler Lockett type player. But all those guys I mentioned have limited ceilings and were drafted on day 2, so I think that's probably where Downs is going to go. Now, Jalen Hyatt is really close to Downs in terms of a prospect, in my opinion. I also think he should go in the second round. Hyatt really didn't do too much at Tennessee until this past year when he exploded for 1,267 yards and 15 touchdowns, even winning the Biletnikoff Award. Compared to the other top guys, he's the fastest wide receiver. He ran a 4.4 flat at the combine, and he's a little bit bigger than Downs and Flowers. He's at 6 foot, 185 pounds. But there are some similar concerns to Downs as far as playing against press coverage. He's a pretty skinny, lengthy guy, and he only had 1 catch against press all of last season. And Tennessee's offense did a good job of getting him in space with free releases. But because of that, it makes his evaluation a lot harder because we did not see him beat press a whole lot in college, and now he's going to have to beat it consistently in the NFL, so it's unknown really how he will fare in the league because of that. But contrary to Downs, Hyatt is seen more as a deep threat. Some people even consider him the top one in the draft. Personally, I just don't think Hyatt is very polished. He's not a great route runner, and he's not very fluid. He's not great after the catch, and most of his speed and explosiveness is straight line speed, so I think that severely limits his ceiling in the NFL. I think we're looking at a deep threat specialist. I don't think he can be a top receiver on a team. Maybe he becomes a Will Fuller or a Mike Wallace type player, which is solid, but not really what I'm looking for in a top wide receiver prospect. Now, someone who's emerged as one of the most controversial players in the entire draft is Jackson Smith-Njigba, and I can't lie, I am not super high on him as a player. At Ohio State, he didn't play much his freshman year in a loaded wide receiver room, but as a sophomore, he exploded on the scene with 1,600 yards and 9 touchdowns, including 347 yards and 3 touchdowns in the Rose Bowl, and he put together that type of season again in a pretty stacked wide receiver room with Garrett Wilson and Chris Olave. So naturally, after that season, he was seen as the next big wide receiver prospect, but this past year, he only played in 3 games due to a hamstring injury, and I can't lie, it's a pretty weird situation. He got hurt in the first quarter of the first game of the season against Notre Dame and then never really got healthy from it. He apparently tweaked it a month after it initially happened, but people thought he would be back at some point, like if Ohio State made a run to the playoffs. But early December, he tweeted out that he was not going to be returning for the rest of the season, and he was going to be declaring for the NFL draft, which then got people thinking, how hurt is he really? Is he just quitting? And all sorts of questions like that, because it was just seen as a hamstring injury. But regardless, JSN probably has the highest floor out of any of these wide receivers, if not any player in the draft, but his ceiling is why I'm a little bit iffy on him. I basically view him as a really good slot wide receiver and nothing more, and that's okay. He's not going to burn you outside. He's not going to be a guy you lob it up to and expect him to moss somebody. He's got decent size size at 6 feet, 200 pounds, but he does not have good speed. He skipped the 40 at the combine for that very reason, but I think he has around a 4.6, 4.7 type of speed. I think in the NFL, he's going to be like a Jarvis Landry or Amon-Ra St. Brown. That's a pretty popular comparison that he's gotten. A guy who's really good after the catch, a safety blanket for quarterbacks, but he's not super dynamic and he's a little bit limited with what he can do. I think he's a good player with a very high floor and a relatively low ceiling, and I do think some teams in the NFL value a slot receiver a lot more than others, so I do think he'll be drafted in the back half of the first round to be that type of slot chess piece from one of those teams that really value them. Now, Zay Flowers is really interesting to me because I think he's got a mix of both Downs and Hyatt. He's got the after the catch ability of Downs, but also can be a deep threat. He played 4 years at Boston College, but definitely had his biggest role this past year with 1,077 yards and 12 touchdowns. Flowers is also a smaller wide receiver like Downs at only 5'9", 180 pounds, and there's some concerns about his hands as he had a 10.3% drop rate in his college career, but he's still very explosive with the ball in his hands. He's a good route runner and he can separate, so I still think he's a late first round type of prospect. His early years in the NFL, he may be better suited for the slot, but his slight increase of size and explosiveness compared to Downs, I think may allow him to be a wide receiver 2 for a team down the line. I've seen some people compare him to Antonio Brown, which is a little crazy, but other comparisons I've seen like Brandon Cooks I think is pretty fair. Now, similarly to a lot of people going into this college football season, I was leaning towards Jordan Addison being my wide receiver 1 for the 2023 draft. He had a down year at USC this past season compared to what he did at Pitt in 2021 with almost 1,600 yards and 17 touchdowns while winning the Biletnikoff Award. He only had 875 yards and 8 touchdowns for the Trojans, but I'm still pretty high on Addison. He's a great route runner and separator, the best in the draft in my opinion, and he has just enough of explosiveness and speed. Some concerns though are common with the other receivers in this class. He's only 6 feet, 175 pounds. He's not too great at contested catches and sometimes gets manhandled by bigger corners. He also had a 9.5% drop rate in college, which means his hands are a little bit questionable at times, but I think his skills as a route runner and separator are pretty special, so I think he's like a Jerry Jeudy, Devontae Smith type of player, so a mid to late first round pick for me makes sense for Addison. And the last top receiver I see in this class is Quentin Johnston from TCU. He's really the only wide receiver in this class I see being a true X wide receiver for a team. He's 6'3", 210 pounds and has some good explosiveness, including a 4.4 40 and a 40-inch vertical. He had over 1,000 yards for the first time in his college career this past year, along with 6 touchdowns, and really was the engine of that TCU offense. He's got good size, good speed, he's good after the catch, he can run routes, so there's a lot to like about him as a wide receiver prospect. The concerns though is Johnson doesn't use his size very well, he doesn't high point the ball very much, he doesn't out physical corners a lot, and he's also dealt with a handful of injuries in his college career. Some scouts have some concerns about his durability because he's a pretty lengthy wide receiver, and when you're that explosive and that big, you tend to deal with little nicks and knacks here and there. And then there's also some concerns that he can be disengaged from the game if the ball is not going his way. So it'll be interesting to see where he goes with how different teams view wide receivers. He may not be the first one off the board, but I do think he should go in the mid first. He's a true boomer bust player in my eyes. I could easily see him being an all-pro type of player, but also somebody who doesn't really pan out due to some of the concerns I mentioned. I think at his peak, he could be an AJ Green or Alshon Jeffrey type of talent, and his measurables give him an edge over the rest of the guys in the receiver class due to each guy really having their own big question mark. But as I mentioned earlier in the video, I'm not particularly hyped up about this receiver class. I do think it's pretty weak. I think these players are pretty good, but the upside for the class is definitely not where I would want it to be if I needed a receiver. If you go back to the 2020 NFL draft, for example, we have multiple top echelon NFL wide receivers. Justin Jefferson leads the way. He's probably the best receiver in football right now. CeeDee Lamb, he's probably a top 10 wide receiver. He's been really good for Dallas, especially this past year. And even T. Higgins for the Bengals, I think he's a wide receiver 1 on probably half the teams in the NFL. So you have 3 wide receiver 1s, and then you also have some solid wide receiver 2s with Jerry Jeudy, Brandon Ayuk, and that's not even mentioning Henry Ruggs. We know about his situation. Maybe he could have been a really electric and nice player as well if he was able to stay on the field. And then you go to 2021 and you have Jamar Chase, you have Jalen Waddle, you have Devontae Smith, you even throw in Amon-Ra St. Brown, and that's 4 really good receivers in that class as well. I think Jamar Chase and Jalen Waddle are wide receiver 1s. I think Devontae Smith is a borderline wide receiver 1, but regardless, again, there's 2 really good wide receivers, arguably 2 top 10 wide receivers with Waddle and Chase, and then a third one which is really close behind them in Devontae Smith. And then, as I already mentioned, the best slot wide receiver in football in Amon-Ra St. Brown. And then it's a little bit hard to judge after 1 year, but the 2022 NFL draft class for receivers was really good this past year as well. Garrett Wilson led the way for the Jets. Chris Olave was really good as well, and Drake London. Jahan Dotson and George Pickens were awesome. Christian Watson even showed some flashes. classes. We didn't even see who was supposed to be the top wide receiver in that class with Jameson Williams. He only played in a couple games off of an ACL injury for the Lions. So I think next year we will really begin to see how good Jameson Williams is. And if he turns out to be as good as I think he can be, that's another great wide receiver class. So when you compare this class to the last 3 drafts, I just do not think it's comparable whatsoever. I just think the overall talent and upside of the receivers in the past couple of drafts is just way higher than what we're going to see this year. And that's okay. It's not going to be a great wide receiver class every single season, but I would like people to accept that and not expect these guys to be as good as what we've seen for the past couple of drafts. But let me know your opinion on this receiver class and who your top player is. And thank you so much for watching the video. If you are new to the channel, be sure to subscribe and drop a like on the video if you did enjoy it. Some more draft content will be on the way. But with all that being said, thank you so much for watching, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.